Now, when it comes to fundraising events, have particularly proud history of conducting successful events in those states, raising funds and doing hospitals, and special events as fundraising events are really popular because they actually are able to work. And one of the reasons that makes them work is because they bring people together. They have food and other refreshments, which are basically the basic ingredients for creating social glue. And so diverse is the range of possible events that a nonprofit can conduct. However, there are major categories of fundraising events that we actually need to be able to consider. So let's look at some of those major categories of fundraising events. So we will start with what we call receptions. And a reception is basically a common form of an event that is actually provided with or without alcoholic beverages, and also celebrity entertainment as well. So it's always good to be able to consider receptions as critical events that actually need to be provided with alcoholic beverages and celebrity entertainment as expected. And this will basically include things like tastings, where events that provide tasting of food and beverages becomes quite important. Then there is also what we call the openings and the performances, that is common events in the arts sector, and attendees are offered previews of new exhibits or new performances or shows as expected. So that also becomes very important to be able to consider. Then there is also the issue of the meals, where we have dinner dances that is popular, particularly for old age groups. They actually can be able to prefer dinner dances. Also, there is also what we can also categorize as testimonials and tributes, where these are basically designed to pay tribute to people and honor their work with gifts to a nonprofit. Typically, they are typically luncheon or dinner affairs that will actually be able to work under this category. Or sometimes we can do breakfast and lunches. The audience is drawn from the business as expected. So it's important to make sure that we can be able to do the breakfast and the lunches as well. Then the other thing is participation events, where we can be able to have athletic activities. That is increasingly common. Will basically include competitive runs, jogathons, walkathons, contests, and tournaments as participation events. These are also good. They're also good events to make sure that we are able, we're actually able to be able to collect certain funds as much as possible. So they are also critical. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of people organizing marathons to fundraise, or organizing walkathons, that is a walk or a tournament, basically to be able to provide fundraising funds as much as possible. Then there's also what we call auctions and gaming. These are similarly popular for online events, which can be a great way of engaging geographically diverse audience to be able to offer support as expected. Then there's also the whole issue of the community mega events. So it is important also to be able to consider community mega events as well. Now, how do we bring in volunteers? So, of course, the first thing is we are able to deal with volunteer recruitment. where you need to make sure you develop your job description, develop your person specification, communicate the vacancy for the volunteers, initially screen applications, then shortlist candidates, then apply for references, then interview and select the volunteers, and then select the successful candidate. That's a typical process of recruitment, which is very, very important. And so a typical volunteer recruitment process is presented in the figure beside, as you can see. And the process normally begins with the identification of the need that we want to fill with that particular volunteer. So organizations therefore need to be able to conduct an analysis of their labor requirements and also determine whether one or more of the required roles would actually be conducted by the volunteers as expected. Then after that, you need to be able to do the placement, the training and orientation, which is something that we need to be able to hold dearly. And please note that first impressions made on volunteers need to ensure and tend to endure and are difficult to reverse. And so supervisors would want to educate new volunteers thoroughly about the organizations, its structure, its purpose, and its activities. Then thirdly, is important also to do quality supervision, where good supervision is key in providing effective fundraising, and also ensuring that we have stable and highly motivated volunteer fundraising team as expected. Then the other thing is performance evaluation or appraisal, where volunteers should actually be subjected to the same internal program of evaluation as paid staff. And finally, also, you need to make sure that volunteers exit the organization. So many nonprofits nowadays will conduct exit interviews for volunteers when they terminate, so that we can be able to understand how to be able to improve the quality of support and opportunities next time. So it's always good to make sure that you're able to do that as much as possible. Now let's look at this whole issue as the last thing that we look at, the issue of leading fundraising teams. So it's always good to be able to know. So leadership is critical in terms of leading fundraising teams, and that's why we are emphasizing it here. So it's a critical functionality because fundraisers at all levels within the organizations, whether they are salaried fundraisers or volunteer fundraisers, as we've just looked at, will always be able to encounter a variety of group situations and may be called on to manage as part of their role. And so it is therefore imperative that they are actually able to reflect on their individual strengths, weaknesses as leaders, what behaviors or characteristics might make them more effective for this particular role. And leadership basically becomes a critical process through which an individual will guide others towards the achievement of an objective as expected. And so it is therefore best thought as an influencing process as well. So leadership is basically influence, and that's what basically works. So although in some circumstances, a leader may have to resort to coercion, successful leaders avoid this by exerting incremental influence beyond the formal authority bestowed by them by the organization. So whenever you capitalize on influencing, then you have better success in the project as expected. Now let's look at some of the leadership theories that help us in terms of appreciating leadership when managing fundraising teams. So the first theory that we're going to look at, they're basically two main theories and sub-theories under them. And the first theory is what we call the trait theory. And this trait theory is, of course, a bit different from the behavioral theory, because the trait theory basically talks about researchers seek to understand leadership by comparing the characteristics or traits of effective leaders with ineffective leaders, and leaders will normally share common characteristics that would actually be able to make them perform well in the leadership role. And so it's important to be able to look at that. And if followed, that is for other people who exhibit these traits, could be fine, then they too could also become great leaders as expected. And so the failure of the trait theory in the 1940s basically led to the explanation of the variation in leadership performance, led researchers to be able to focus on a different facet of leadership, which is behaviors as exhibited by successful leaders. So trait theory was more of a proponent where they were promoting leaders are born rather than made, but the behavior theory tries to emphasize that leaders are made mainly than born. So that's some of the things that we're able to understand. So the behavioral theory definitely had considerable interest in the 1960s. Because if appropriate behaviors could be identified, instead of identifying individuals with the right traits, then leadership would actually be able to improve. And this worldview was, of course, emphasizing that leaders can be made and not born as expected. And so let's look at one of the sub-theories under the behavioral theories, which is what we call the Blake Mouton managerial grid. And in this particular theory, so we're able to classify leaders in different categories. Like, for instance, we're able to classify leadership as impoverished, that is, leadership that is here basically has minimum efforts to get the work done, utilizes a lazy approach. Then there is also what we call produce or perish, where strong focus on task but little concern on people. So that's a behavior that you can actually see in leadership. There are leaders that basically will focus so much on the task and they have no concern for the people. Then there's also what we call country crab, where the leadership concern and care is for the people, becoming comfortable and also a friendly environment or a collegial style, but they actually have a very low focus on the task as expected. Then number 4, we have the middle of the road, where there is a weak balance between focusing on people and task or the work. And then there is also team management, where we pay strong attention to both dimensions. So concern for people and concern for production is something that we are able to concern ourselves as much as possible. So basically the Blake and Mouton managerial grid becomes very, very important for us to be able to understand a few aspects of leadership. Then there's what we call contingency theory. And contingency theory basically offers a more plausible perspective on leadership. And as the name suggests, it posits that the desirable approach for a leader will always vary by context. And so a consequence of this is that leaders who are effective at one place and time may become unsuccessful when transplanted into another situation or when factors around them change. So that's what we're able to refer as the contingency theory, that basically helps us to understand how leadership basically happens. So whenever you, so it supports the fact that when leaders are actually put in the right context, then they will perform. When they are put in the wrong context, then they will not be able to perform as expected. Then there is the charismatic leadership that was able to develop during the 1980s. And the focus in this form of leadership shifted to the topics of charisma and how organizations can achieve global competitiveness. Charisma is a Greek word that means divinely inspired gift, such that being able to foretell the future or perform a miracle as expected. Now, the meaning of this context of leadership is rather more mundane and refers to the form of social influence that is actually shown on the followers. And that becomes the charismatic leadership that we're able to see. Then there are also two types of leadership that we also need to be able to consider. That's transactional and transformational. And so far, the models that we have been able to look at before basically are providing us with what we call a transactional leader, where a transactional leader is, I give you this, then you expect to do this. But there is now the concept of transformational leaders that we are able to also consider. And transformational leaders will normally inspire their followers to look beyond their own self-interest for the greater good of the organization. So as a leader, you're able to inspire your team to look beyond their personal interests to make sure that they deliver the broader good of the organization. And so transformational leaders will normally provide a compelling vision. They will instill a genuine sense of pride in their followers and also ensure that they're able to work towards the compelling vision that has been provided. And so transformational leadership also becomes quite a good leadership style to be able to use. And what I've done also is I've tried to differentiate between a transactional leader and a transformational leader. So you can see a transactional leader will be a contingent reward. That is, give me this so that I give you this. And then they also manage by exception. That is, use rules, standards, and corrective action. They also management by exception, passive, that they will only be active if the standards are not actually met. But if the standards are met, then they are not active. They are laissez-faire, that is, they abdicate responsibilities and they avoid making decisions as expected. But this is different from a transformational leader, because a transformational leader will always have idealized influence, so able to provide vision and mission and instill pride and respect. Instill respect and trust, and then they are also able to be known as inspirational motivators. They also intellectually stimulate people, so they're able to promote intelligence, rationality, and careful problem solving. And then they have individualized consideration, where they give personal attention, treat each employee individually, and then coach and advise them as well. So you can always be able to see which leadership style becomes most effective for the teams that you're managing in terms of the fundraising team. So we end there, and maybe we can be able to end by taking a few comments or questions that you may have.